With that, I would like to welcome everyone. I'm Romy Martin. I'm the president for the Rotary Club ROAM 5790, which stands for Rotary Across the Metroplex and online across the Metroplex. And I would like to officially welcome Mark Grace to our meeting. He's the Chief of Mission and Ministry for Baylor Scott and White. Really what he's based on, Dell, is your support every location that Baylor is in, and you see a lot of different cases, and you support multiple religious backgrounds within your group. So I would like to welcome you and thank you so much for coming to speak to us about how do we take care of ourselves, what do we do, how do we recognize, because we're a service organization, we like to serve in a community and support others. And that can sometimes take a strain and we forget to take care of ourselves. So what can we do to kind of take a pause and do that so we can continue having strength and supporting others?
Thanks, Romy.
Yep. And I noticed also that today is the World Day of Prayers. And I know that you're somewhat of an expert in that field, so I would like to ask if you don't mind starting us off with a prayer, actually.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Is everybody okay with me voicing a prayer?
No, absolutely.
Okay. Lord, we thank you for bringing us together here tonight, and I pray your protection, your care, your love would be somehow stirred up, that we might not just face reality, but that in that reality that we might stir up in each other the reality of mutual support and care. And we pray for wisdom and increased sense of reassurance and strength. As each of us leaves this place, I just pray that the outcome might be that each of us might be better equipped to do the work that we do, to care for those that we love, and to fulfill our callings. And I pray all these things in the name of my Savior Jesus, and I invite you to pray in the name of that which is sacred to you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Romy. I was not expecting that. I am a hospital chaplain. I've been a minister since I was 12 years old. Don't ask for that. That's too long a story. So as you might have sort of picked up on, I come from a particular viewpoint, but my for the last 37 years, my principal arena of work has been in healthcare, and my ethical commitment and sense of calling has been to support people of all faiths and those of none, so that to help them mobilize their spiritual resources. I'm very comfortable with that. I was talking with one of our hospital president of Grapevine yesterday, who was really thrilled to hear that we might actually ask a Jewish person or a Muslim person to say one of the prayers overhead. And I'm not trying to make fun of that person. I think sometimes, at least the Baylor healthcare side of this has been so thoroughly associated with Baptist life and connected with Baptist life that sometimes people inside our own organization don't stop to think that with 46,000 employees, there might be a few people there who don't identify either as with a particular religious denomination or as religious at all. And for me, that's been the real joy. I enjoy that atmosphere. I've learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues from all faiths and those from none. So that's the approach that I bring now. You're gonna catch me sharing a few scriptures with you along the way. they form a sort of foundation, but I share them in particular tonight because I think they connect to very important principles and key themes that are espoused across religious lines, and I'll bring that up. I'm going to see if I can share my PowerPoint with you, and I will try to keep the PowerPoint from getting in the way. If at any point it starts getting in the way of our conversation, will let me know. Anybody here listen to Jackson Brown at all? No Jackson Brown. Well, you know, I grew up with Jackson Brown. That's a dead giveaway about me being a baby boomer. But he has a beautiful song called "Standing in the Breach," and it's the musical equivalent of what you were talking about a minute ago, Romy. Is that you all feel a sense? Each of you feel a sense of call to service, and yeah. So if you get a chance, check him out on YouTube. It's a great song. In a sense, each of us are attempting to stand in the breach. That is to hold together relationships and to continue forward with business and service endeavors in a way that brings healing and help to human beings. The title here is indicative of what I think needs to happen first, is that we have to stand up for ourselves before we can really stand in the breach. And I came across this a lot of years ago. I am not a military person, but one of my chaplains, who was a reserve military officer, shared first aid training course materials that he had in the military. And the very first thing in the manual was when you find yourself in a crisis situation, let's say somebody falls in the river, our instinct is to jump in after them. But what the Army teaches, or at least taught back then, is no, first you take care of yourself, because you don't want two fatalities. You want to be sure that you're in shape to take care of the person in the water. And that's kind of the what would you call it? That's the basic assumption that I'm taking with this PowerPoint. There's a beautiful story in the book of Nehemiah where after Nehemiah leads a group of people to return to Jerusalem and to begin to rebuild that city after it had been destroyed. Then in Isaiah, there is this beautiful verse that talks about people who are attempting to restore what has been laid to waste. It says, and they shall be of thee, and they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. They shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. And I don't know if you relate to that, but for me, that really seems to identify the challenge, not just in healthcare, but all throughout. Let me pause there. I get bored with my own voice very quickly, but anybody have any questions about that? You have another angle on those basic assumptions that you'd like to voice?
You said that song was called Standing in the Breach?
Standing in the Breach by Jackson Brown, with an E, B-R-O-W-N-E. Yeah. Well, I've got a feeling that every one of you may be slightly more expert on a certain slice of pandemic statistics. Here are some that are specifically related to mental health. So, and they're taken from various places, some from Pew, some from the Census Bureau, some from Gallup polls. But does it surprise you to know that the economy is now a significant source of stress for 70% of Americans? Or that the government response is a significant source of stress for 67%? Or that more than one third of Americans have displayed clinical signs of anxiety, depression, or both since the pandemic began. Now that's compared to, I will tell you, about this time last year, I was speaking to a group of ministers about burnout in ministry and the mental health of ministers. And the statistic I was quoting then was that around 20% of people in the population suffer from depression. Now we're looking at a 33% figure. Now, when you pair up number 4 with that statistic, I'm not smart enough at math to get those all figured out, but if only half of employees are comfortable discussing mental health issues with their employer, that leaves a significant number of people who are not talking about what's going on. They may present well over Zoom, but they may not be doing that well, after the computer gets turned off. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans say they've had a physical reaction, and I'm one of those, by the way, when thinking about the outbreak. In March, a Pew survey, 18% of people said they experienced nervousness or anxiety most or all of the time during the past week. And I would be willing to bet it's probably more now. Text messages to the CDC, a government federal disaster distress hotline that's specifically focused on mental health, increased more than 1,000% in April. As you might well imagine, mental health is poorest among folks who've been employed for the longest period of time. Long-term psychological consequences of collective traumas, that's what this is pandemic can be characterized as a collective trauma, can last a decade or more. And these statistics are taken from studies of mental health of survivors of Katrina, by the way. So we've had a chance to study what happens to people when they go through this kind of stress and strain and traumatic social incidents. And then according to Pew, okay, there we are. 1/3 of adults ages 18 to 29 are in the high distress group. And I'm wondering, Courtney, does that line up with what you are seeing among your folks? We were talking a minute ago as though your group was happy-go-lucky, but how do you see that number 10? And does it line up with your own experience working with college-age kids? Sorry, I'm guilty of ageism. With college-age adults.
Yeah, and but we're seeing it all over the place. Students were more or less promised a certain experience when they graduated from high school and went off to college, and they're not getting that. Not only that, but they're going into college not knowing if they are going to get the bang for their buck. There's been all this controversy about student loans. Now the economy is going south, and and this is, and they're still young. When you're that, even when you're in your 20s, you don't really have the capacity to see long term. When something lingers like this thing has, you start to wonder if it's ever going to go away, because you haven't experienced something like this that did go away. You just never experienced anything that's lasted this long. So yeah, I'm not in that range. I'm 32, but I'm definitely stressed out. I'm not, we haven't made it big yet, my husband and I. And just as an example, I remember hearing whenever this all started that the divorce rate shot up because people were being isolated with their spouses and spending too much time together, I guess. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's silly. My husband is my best friend, and we had a blast for the first few weeks. But then things started to change, and I started noticing things that I'd never noticed before. So my mental health, possibly his mental health, at the same time were affected. Plus,
Yeah. And it's a delicate balance. I mean, there, in all of the difficult experience, there is buried there potential for good. But none of us know that until we get to the other side of it, right?
And count my little blessings.
Yeah. Even for a 64-year-old. Now, I'm old enough to have a daughter and who's in her 30s. And we've had some of the most incredible conversations. We've had some of the most difficult conversations because we're both, we both have more time to chew on this stuff. And on the days when she's let me know about my failings as a father, especially when she was growing up, it was just excruciating. You think, oh my gosh, I wish this pandemic had never happened. Why did I have to hear this stuff? Well, I probably was going to hear about it eventually. I like to think, but it raises the stakes on things, I guess. Yeah. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever heard about the Stockdale Paradox.
Say that again, please, Mark. The Stockdale what?
The Stockdale Paradox. Larry, you might recognize this guy.
Well, it's a familiar term, and I just trying to remember what it was.
He was, by the way, Ross Perot's running mate way back when Ross Perot ran for president. He was fairly old then, but Commander Stockdale was a prisoner of war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And this is what he had to say about that whole experience. He said, the people that lasted, the people who lasted were not the optimists. The optimists were the people who are always thinking tomorrow's going to be better. Things will get better, next week. They're gonna let us out, and they were continually disappointed. His take on his experience and the experience of his fellow Vietnam prisoners of war was that the hard-headed realists were the ones who made it all the way through, who didn't give up emotionally, and that emotional determination, sort of hard-headed realism, was what helped to sustain them physically as well under very stressful circumstances. So his theory is that we've got to be realistic. We have to face the problem. And that, folks, it isn't being negative to say, yeah, this could last a long time. It's not necessarily being negative to say the impact of this is going to be with us for a decade or more after this is over. But that's part of the real part of information about reality that we need. So, yeah, James Stockdale. Here's another scripture that I think typifies what you were talking about, Courtney, that a lot of folks are experiencing. And this comes from, again, from the Psalms and from the story of the nation of Israel being uprooted, as was the common practice at that time. So the Babylonians defeated the Israelites and carried them all off, uprooted them from their own land. And in a very poignant scripture, the psalmist says, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? We sat down by the waters of Babylon, and we remembered, our home. And we ask ourselves, how can we continue to sing and to sing those songs of hope in a foreign land?" That's typical of the grief that we find when life changes this rapidly. Here are some things I want to suggest, and I think of these as a little bit homemade. They're fairly simple. If you think of a better way or a counterpoint to what I'm doing, you won't offend me in the least. The way I'm used to teaching is very much give and take. But in order to deal with this from a mental health perspective, I think we have to be willing to do some things to be able to look back in order to move forward. And that's the power of that psalm. It's the power of our being willing to give ourselves the permission to grieve over what's been lost now in the moment, even to grieve the loss of some dreams, at least, that have been put on hold for a while. One of the ways to do that is to look back into our personal history, not to confirm how weak we are, which is, or how much wrong we have done, which is a very common human, but to ask ourselves, how did I deal with crisis in the past, and what strengths am I bringing to this crisis that'll help me? Into the history of our community, and I've often thought about this, especially the older I get. My father was born in my mother and father were born in 30 and 32, right in the teeth of the Dust Bowl. They were born in the panhandle of Texas. They used to have things called mud storms there that literally suffocated the livestock. And people went crazy from the dust storms. They lost their sanity, some for long periods of time, because of that issue. And in my own family, I've often thought about the heritage that I have. There's no guarantee that I'm going to be able to deal with this, but I remember hanging out with my great aunts and uncles, with my parents and my grandparents, and always admiring the realistic, hard-headed realism and resourcefulness that they brought and that they gave to me. The other side of that is that they could be very impatient with people who did not bear up well under stress. But the gift that they gave, not just to me, but I see this in my children now, is this sort of tradition of realism. Each of us has those kind of things, whether it was parents or whether it has been people in a community that we've been connected to. So looking back, allowing ourselves to grieve our losses, and then taking a real look to understand what our real resources are, rather than getting stuck on either it's all got to be good or it was all bad. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to interject. I took a training recently, and there was something in there that that I think is woven throughout several of these points, and it's that change is inevitable. The only thing that you can count on is change.
Amen.
And and when you look at it that way, you're not as, I guess, you don't get held up on when is this going to be over. You recognize that this is a change, that it's going to continue in one way or another. And even though we will get back to a sense of normalcy, it may never look like what it did before. And that's okay. I mean, time moves on, the world keeps turning. And yeah, I can see that looking into your personal history, into the history of your community, you'll be able to see when change happened, and it seemed scary at first, but everything was all right, and we're still here.
Yeah, and to be able to share that with each other, one of the things that's been really kind of wonderful, the wonderful part of this is in our family, my mother has dementia now, so we have to keep reminding her of why she can't, why she can't leave the nursing home. She's on a locked unit now because she kept walking out into the parking lot and not wanting to go back. She is pleasantly demented. And the beautiful part about that, the unintended part for me, has been listening to the stories, because she remembers her past better than she remembers what happened 5 minutes ago. And it's a continual reminder of those two things that you talked about, that life was never perfect. It was never perfect. Her dad, my grandfather, drove a milk truck for a creamery, and it was he had a student driver driving in it, and without making a long story out of this, it got hit. He spent a year in the hospital and then a year in a full body cast after that in the 1940s, and my mother remembers that much more vividly than she can remember, to put her mask on. But listening to her story, listening to her talk about that, has really reminded me in a very deep way of the resilience that she brought. It doesn't guarantee that I'm going to be resilient, but it gives me a great deal of reassurance. Yeah. And I love what you said. Our Buddhist friends use the term impermanence. In Christian scriptures, we're reminded that our lives are like the grass that it fades away instantly. And all of those reminders, they could be occasion for depression unless and until we embrace this fact that change happens.
But I think the struggle is that, I actually enjoy change, and I appreciate change because this is how you grow. But I think what makes it more difficult if you cannot find something constant to hold on to in the storm. Right? If you're in a storm and everything is changing around you, but you don't have something that you can hold on to, then you lose the ground underneath your feet. And I think that's what's so difficult for some people. As long as you could feel your feet on the ground, so to speak, you're okay. But it's when you lose sight of everything and you don't have something constant, and everything around you is constantly changing, and it's a whirlwind, and you literally get dizzy standing there. That's what makes it so difficult, I think, for people. And when it gets to be too much, it's not always the little changes that, it's not just the virus, it's your work, and it's the political climate, and it's your kids, and it's your spouse or your friends, and everything around you that seems to be out of your control sometimes, that you can't hold on to something.
Yeah.
It's like the kids, my kids, they're doing okay as long as, my little one has her little blanket she holds onto. As long as she has the world, that's fine. My 16-year-old still has a plush animal. He sleeps with it every night. Probably shouldn't be mentioning this on every recording.
No, not that loudly.
But it's, I know that if anything goes back, as long as they can go have that, they can make it through. And I think it's, how do we find and not lose sight of that one thing we can hold on to that isn't?
That's an incredibly powerful point. And when you talked about the Banky, as some children call it, that's known. Robert Keegan, the object relations theorist, talked about that as the very first transitional object. And he was talking exactly about what you're saying, is that if we have something to hold on to through deep change, I was amazed. This is many years ago, so I can't vouch for the research, but I was amazed. I was brought up, listening to lots of worrying in the church about cults. And when I got into chaplaincy on psychiatric units, I read some studies about how, now definitely there are cults, and we know those stories that have been very, very dangerous for people to be in, but that at that time, the vast majority of young people, those cults served as a transitional object for people, for young people who are having difficulty figuring out how to separate attachment from their family. Now, that might not be the best of examples, but I think it might give us a few clues about how to support ourselves, how to support the people that we love and the people that we serve, is to ask ourselves, what is the transitional object that might help this person to remain steady? Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are, but I do want to talk a little bit about what up until recently was known as complicated grief. That happens. Complicated mourning is when people don't snap back from grief the way we think they ought to. Now, normal grief process takes anywhere from 18 to 24 months. But we know that if you lose someone suddenly, unexpectedly, in very, very difficult circumstances, if you lose someone and their body can't be recovered, that all of those things are predictors of sudden, unexpected grief. And I will tell you, part of the deep pain that I feel these days is, as a chaplain, watching families lose loved ones without being able to be with them in their final hours. I mean, it's just excruciating. And part of it is that I know that that's an extra load for them to carry. Courtney, you were going to say something? Oh, okay. I thought, sorry.
I scratched my pen, sorry.
I'm anxious to interrupt myself. Now, the only caution I have when I put up a list like this is it's not, if one of these applies to you, then you have complicated morning, or someone you know has complicated morning. It's more about what we call a constellation of symptoms, just like the screening questions. You know, just because you've got a sore throat this morning doesn't mean you have COVID. You have to have several of those. What's important about this list, and by the way, I'm going to share this PowerPoint with you. What's important about the list is realizing that these really are potential ways that grief can manifest, especially grief that and loss of a loved one that happens under very difficult circumstances. And then you see the list. Now, complicated mourning doesn't apply just to the death of a loved one. I mean, you all have named several things: loss of a job, loss of a place to stay, loss of certainty about the future. Young people who think, oh yeah, I'm going to go get such and such degree in 4 years, and then I'm going to get my master's, and then I'll start a career, are suddenly going, wow, is this going to happen? Is it going to happen like I thought? Am I? Well, anyway, I'm kind of telling you your business, but it doesn't just have to be lost due to a death. Any comments from your angle? Have you seen this happening with folks that you know, or?
No, but I think there's a definite correlation between how you feel in your head, right, and how you're eventually going to feel in your body. So if your mind isn't healthy, your body can't be healthy.
Yeah.
Even though if your body isn't healthy, your mind can be healthy. It just doesn't work the other way around. So I think it's so important to start with that mental health, because eventually I think it will translate into body aches and pains of various sorts, and a broken heart, and that is a real thing, right?
Yeah, and we don't know exactly what will break that person's heart, because we were all driving down this road at 90 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden somebody put up a barricade, and we don't. We may know the people that we know best. We may have an idea, but we really can't predict how the loss of a dozen small things or one huge thing will impact people. And I think that's why we have to be extra alert, both within ourselves, for the people that we love and the people that we serve. The paradoxical part of this is the more that we give ourselves the opportunity to grieve, and the more that we can normalize that with the people that we live with and the people that we work with. Paradoxically, the more likely we all are to be able to get through this in the best shape possible. And Romy and I worked with chaplains. I mean, that was part of her. We're a real touchy-feely group of people, but one of the things that I've just discovered working with chaplains is you have to give them plenty of room to get those emotions out, because they're working with people every single day who are facing death and dying. Who are working under stressful circumstances, and you don't just go in and pull your shift and then go home. And I think that's probably true for most of you on this call.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of empathetic people, I think, even within our group. right? That want to help, that see an issue, that want to help and go out of their way to support others, and financially or through tasks and you know, and donations in other ways. And it's kind of like a sponge. You can only take in so much before you have to figure out how you can release that somewhere yourself.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and it's not like you cannot go talk about it to other people, right, to release.
Yeah.
So you have to figure out a different way to process it and set it aside and deal with it.
Well, and interestingly enough, you know, part of my job is training chaplains, and what I say all the time is, it isn't the answers that we bring that help people. And sometimes when I have a student, they have to turn in reports of their ministry encounters, their conversations with people, and occasionally I'll give a student an assignment. I'll say, all I want you and I to talk about over the next 5 weeks as you bring your reports to me is I want you to bring me reports of people who have affirmed you. And all I want us to do is look at what they said when they said, "Oh, gee, chaplain, thank you." What did they thank you for? And I don't know where I picked that up from. I'm sure it was not my own idea, but I consider it to be a genius idea because, you know, overwhelmingly what people say when they feel supported under circumstances of real stress, of deep grief, they say, "Thank you for being here." They don't say, "Oh, chaplain, what you said was so mind-blowing. That I've never heard a piece of wisdom like that before in my life." What they say is, "Thank you for being with me." And one way to be with people is just simply to ask them for the story.
Mm-hmm.
To be curious about their story and to listen very patiently. Is that your dog?
I think he agreed with you.
That's beautiful. Now, the first part was looking back. The second part, we've actually been talking about a lot here, but do you all know this term bricolage? Y'all just,
Never have heard of it.
well, the definition of it is up here at the top. Bricolage is associated with resilience. So when you hear, when you get into resilience training, they may not use that term specifically, but they'll talk about making use of resources at hand to meet unanticipated needs. Isn't that what we've been doing all along? And it's amazing to me. And I'd like to just to stop and ask, one unexpected delight or one unexpected resource that you've discovered during this whole lockdown. Something that you weren't doing before or aware of before that has become useful or maybe even important to you now in the lockdown.
The pizza place down the street. Sorry, that was just a joke.
Oh no, I don't think it's a joke.
But seriously,
Say more about it though.
Well, I mean, that really was a joke. I love the pizza place down the street, but I loved it before all this happened. It was
Oh, okay.
before that. But I don't know why this popped into my head because it's definitely not one of the major ones, but it's the only thing that's coming to mind right now. Have you ever been in a meeting and you like go into a coughing fit?
Oh yeah.
Well, that's embarrassing. It doesn't matter who you are. You have to get up and leave the leave the room or get it under control, but you're going to be that person that had a coughing fit in the middle of class or in the middle of the meeting. Well, maybe that's juvenile, but I don't know. I do suffer from anxiety myself. Anyway, well, in Zoom, you can just mute it, and nobody know. You can go off the screen. Nobody knows the difference.
Okay, I get it now. I was waiting for the rest of the story.
Sorry.
I really had me sitting on the edge of my seat. Yeah. Or I can turn my camera off, and then you won't think I'm drinking moonshine here. This is just my daily 100 ounces of water that I'm trying to get in an old glass jar. Yeah. Anything else? That's a great one.
I would say this, Mark, something I've noticed about myself, but I noticed on Zoom that I tend to listen quite a bit more effectively when I'm on Zoom, and then when I'm just dealing with people face to face. I don't know if that, and I think I deal pretty well with people face to face, but in terms of listening, but I notice a distinct improvement when I'm on Zoom.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Well,
it's an important thing. But
go ahead,
let me make one other comment.
Yeah, sure.
This definition of bricolage, making use of resources at hand to meet unanticipated needs. One of the things, and I have been a manager since I was 14 years old, of something. And one of the things that you universally run into when you talk to people, they want to know how resourceful you are, especially when you're applying for a managerial job. This comes to mind because that's an extremely important talent to have, so that you can, in fact, handle unanticipated needs that arise, and they're going to arise. It's just a question of under what circumstances. So it's kind of an important. I see it as very important to understand exactly what that means.
Yeah, and it's a part of resilience. I think it's something that we do that we do sometimes almost unconsciously. My example is I've had this app on my phone for a long time, and it's just called Daily Prayer. It follows the Book of Common Prayer. You can pray 4 times a day with it. I put it on my phone and I never used it. And then Linda and I got into this habit of doing noonday prayer because we were both home at the same time for noon, and it had this just incredible, powerful impact. Obviously, for me, the prayer was meaningful, but what was meaningful beyond that was me and Linda being together for those few minutes every day. So I wouldn't call it an intentional use of bricolage. It was kind of like, oh, yeah, why don't we try this? And then discovering something unexpected. Mm-hmm. The skill of bricolage in pursuit of resilience is when we start to make that intentional and deliberate. And we start to ask ourselves, what resources do I have at hand to deal with this grief, to deal with this stress, to deepen my relationship with others, to be more effective at helping others? We have to look around. So there's a realistic assessment of the damage that's happened, a reassuring acceptance of our assets. So I'm going to share a book with you, a title. It's in this PowerPoint. It's called Building Resilience with Appreciative Inquiry. And I started about 5-6 years ago, I started using appreciative inquiry with the students that I supervise in the training programs that I conduct. And it's just to focus on starting with what's right instead of starting with what's wrong. And asking, how can I use the things that I'm doing right to address the challenges that I have? And I actually had a seminary student who was in one of the early programs look at me one day. He had presented one of these ministry encounters to his group. And I said, okay, well, what did so-and-so do right here? And he just got all twisted up, and he said, I know, I did a lot of good things. I want to know what's wrong. He couldn't stand the tension of trying to learn from his strengths, from his own competence. I think I identified with that. That's probably why I'm laughing so much. But accepting our assets, so we're not just looking at the damage, but that even when we don't exactly feel like it, that we accept our assets, embrace our allies. What does that mean to you all, to embrace our allies? Oh, there you are.
Well, they're talking about an encouraging embrace of our allies. Does that mean encouraging embrace from our allies? I'm just curious about the encouraging embrace of our allies says to me, the encouraging embrace from our allies. They're giving something to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it's somebody that we can lean on.
And that's reassuring to people. That's you're reaffirming something that's positive about somebody.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
do you agree with that? Do you agree with that point?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that you found a good way to phrase it. Another way I might put it that I started out with, although you gave this a nice twist, is recognizing that there are people, not just people. In my world, I think of God's presence in my life, and one of the practices that I've been trying out this last week is just to stop and remind myself that God is present. Bidden or unbidden, God is present. I don't need to do anything or be a certain way. But yesterday I came to work, and a colleague of mine that I got one of those really crappy leadership emails about, that is pursuing other opportunities, is in the new building, officing right around the corner from me. And we didn't talk about that particular situation, but I knew that person needed to know that somebody cared about them. They didn't need somebody to come get the dirt. They just needed somebody, metaphorically, to drink a cup of coffee, to stand at a social distance and to say, hey, I'm on your side, Does that line up with what you were saying, Larry?
Yes, definitely.
And empowering view of the transcendent, and it won't surprise you all to know that I think of God and fairly traditional sense. But I don't think, you know, I don't think that we necessarily even, people necessarily even have to use religious language. Last Saturday, I was on my back porch, and hummingbirds came to the false yucca plant. It looks like a century plant, but it's got these beautiful peach-colored flowers on it. And I had the most beautiful experience for a fleeting moment of being part of a world that was much bigger than me, that sustains me. And you know, sometimes sometimes we pursue that in terms of traditional religious experiences, and sometimes we're just open to the immediacy of the present moment, to the reminders that, you know, that nature sends our way or human companionship brings to us. By the way, this is a plug. I don't know if you've heard of the Buddhist. He died last year. A beautiful Buddhist monk. He was a peace activist from Vietnam. He established what I would call an ashram, a Zen community in France called Plum Village, Thich Nhat Hanh. And he said each moment is a chance for us to make peace with the world. He became very, very good friends with a Benedictine monk named David Steindl Ross, who's founded a network for grateful living. And unfortunately, Brother David died last year also. But their legacy lives on through gratefulness.org. I don't know, have any of you ever checked out the videos there?
I haven't.
So this is not the end all and be all, but their resources, incredibly and often powerful resources. And there's been more and more and more research done on the potential impact of gratitude. And you don't have to spend $600 to take a special course. Because the skills are basic. One thing that people don't often think about that research shows is that our gratitude is deepened not just by recalling or journaling. You know, I worked with addicts and alcoholics, and we quite often required them to do a gratitude list. That's straight out of AA, the 12 steps. But one of the things we discovered from the literature, not from our direct research, was that it's effective if you recognize what you can be grateful for, but even more effective if you ask yourself, what if that were missing from my life? And what if I didn't have that relationship in my life? What if I hadn't had that opportunity in my life? What if this hummingbird hadn't come along at this moment? So that's really been shown to deepen the impact of gratitude. This is just an example of taking resources, elements that you would not normally associate with. If someone said to you, I want you to make a sculpture of a dog, and making something incredibly beautiful out of it. That's just an example of bricolage, of you could say repurposing. And then the sense that we're in it together. I want to just tell me when you want to. Okay, I've got 8:14. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we're probably getting close to the end.
Okay, I'm getting close too. So we were talking about this, a about social distancing versus physical distancing. You want to say anything more about that from your perspective? Okay, I think we covered it pretty well.
Yeah. Mark, I'd just like to make a comment.
Sure.
You know, a while ago on the slide, I think it was probably the second or third slide, you showed a bunch of, some statistics. And they were talking about people over 65, that they didn't feel the same way as other age groups about loss, and how they dealt with loss was much different than younger people. And it made me think about all kinds of things in life. I've been, as you and I have been around a while. I've had a lot of experiences, ups and downs. And I'm coming away from this having thought that, it really boils down to what somebody's perspective is. Because if you're 65 or older, your perspective is quite different than Courtney's at age 32, or as my nephew at age 18, or grandson. And so how they deal with things. But, I think if people could realize that this too shall pass, and that things today are not near as important as you think they are. And I think we tend to blow things up probably and again, it depends on your perspective of things and how you look at things. But I think we have a tendency to blow things up. And you look back at life friendships. How many life friendships do people really have? Lifetime friendships. And you think about, it was a big day when you graduated from high school, and, you didn't think too much about it because it was such a happy event. And then a few years later, you look back at it and you suddenly realize that you've lost all the friends or lost contact with most of the friends that you had in high school. And it gets worse from there with the high school population. So, and we don't spend a whole lot of time grieving over that because we learn new and we find new friends and we make our lives better. But then pretty soon those people go away too. So, I think that people need to take that dose of reality that you talked about. But I think it's important that people understand, young people particularly, understand what reality really is in the long term. Because their reality is reality in the short term.
Yeah.
So that's the difference between yours and my perspective as opposed to somebody much younger.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with you, although I would say I'm not sure. It makes a lot of sense to me. The paradox that an 18-year-old might get more worked up about what's happening next year than I might, just because they're bringing less life experience, and each year has a bigger impact on them.
Sure.
I do want to underscore the fact that what's paradoxical about this is that the more room we make for people to talk about their experience in a supportive atmosphere, the more room we make for that, the more likely people are to get to that kind of perspective that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of a respect for the process. The thing that you were pointing out is that our needs at 18 are different than our needs at 30, that are different than our needs at 50 or 60. And just being able to respect those. I
And just because we went through that phase doesn't mean we shouldn't allow others to walk through that phase in life and take out from it. Because it's just as real for them as we experienced it at that time. So I don't want to dismiss that just because, we know it's going to get over, or they're going to get over it at some point, because it's real and it's everything. I mean, even my teenagers, they go through it, and things I wouldn't have thought they would be struggling with. From one moment they're laughing, the next moment they're crying. And it's just because, even if I could laugh about it today, for them, it's real and it's everything. Yeah. And we shouldn't dismiss it.
Alan Keith Lucas wrote a beautiful book a long time ago called Giving and Taking Help. And he made this statement that just hit me between the eyes. He said, the problem we have in giving help to other people is that we remember the lessons that we learned, but we don't remember the price that we paid to learn those lessons. So if we could, we would appreciate, how difficult it is to move toward that. I've still got lots of lessons. This is kind of a summary. And with your permission, I'm going to skip through this. You'll get to look at it more in depth, but this is kind of summarizes what we've been talking about. An ideal state that maybe we all want to get to, but again, with the emphasis on allowing and supporting people in the process. These are some resources for immediate help. I'm not going to talk about these, but you will have them,
we will share those with our group, and might even, with your permission, then post the resources on our website, so then that way, for those that happen to read it, they're able to find those.
You're more than welcome, and you'll see where each of these resources has a website of their own.
Okay.
Here are some books that I love. I'm not going to talk about them, although I am going to talk about a couple of them. So I did talk about Building Resilience Through Appreciative Inquiry. The Unwanted Gift of Grief is a beautiful book written by a colleague of mine who lost his daughter at a very early age. So he knows what he's writing about. Here's one. We haven't talked about the huge impact of the racial tension, but I haven't read this book. I'm looking forward to it, but I heard Menachem in a podcast, and I was just blown away by him, by the way that he reframed racial trauma and the racial tensions. Another favorite author of mine is Matthew Richard, writing about altruism. So that's it. Thank you very, very much. It's been a delight to get to know y'all. Appreciate you putting up with me for an hour and a half.
Oh, thank
Mark,
you.
it's been a real pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll be able to invite you back sometimes, but I appreciate the great resources, and I'll share the presentation with the members then, if you send it over to me, and post some of the resources on our website as well. So
I will. I sure will. Great conversation, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.